He goes on from there, and it says this. This says they divided up his clothes by lots, by casting lots. So he had a really nice or a pretty decent robe. So they were essentially rolling bones to see who got it. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him and offered him wine, vinegar, and said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was a written notice above him which read, this is the king of the Jews. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. Stop there for a second. Now, we know from the other Gospels, for example, Matthew, that both criminals started off hurling insults at him, right? That it wasn't just one of them, that both of them were mocking him. And I think that this demonstrates the radical depravity of us, not them, of us. So, crucifixion is a little bit interesting, not to be morbid, because if you read the Psalms, like Psalm 22, you kind of get this medical version, and it's confirmed by research and doctors. You get medical version of what happens in crucifixion. See, the crossbar on the bottom, you know, the little step, you see that in pictures, right? The feet are nailed, but then you see that little like piece of wood under their feet. It's actually a kind of a cruel joke. Because to breathe over time, you have to push up on your feet. Because what happens is, you know, for example, in Psalm 22, he says, all my bones are out of joint, and my heart is melted like wax within me. So a crucified person who is allowed to continue, what happens is their shoulders and their elbows and their wrists eventually pull out of joint, and their arms elongate. So their arms get anywhere between like 8 to 12 inches longer. And so what happens is they begin to lean forward really far over. And as that begins to happen, if you've ever seen a skeleton, you have a sternum, right here. And so the major ribs, the large ribs, those connect to the sternum by cartilage, right? So if you've ever done CPR right, you feel it rip off the ribs. So what happens is, as your arms stretch at a time, your ribs pull apart. And so the sternum pulls apart from one side of your ribs. And you drift farther and farther. So you have to use your feet to push up to be able to get your diaphragm involved so that you can speak. Does that make sense? So when these guys are speaking and making fun of Jesus, they are using literally all of their strength, enduring mass amount of pain, and exhausting themselves in order to make fun of this guy that's between them. Right? That's pretty wild, isn't it? That's what we'll do as humans. That's how demonic we can get. That from our very own soul, we can sit next to someone else who's crucified and then make fun of him to do that. So that's what's going on here. They're making fun of him. Eventually, for example, it says, my heart melted like wax. So for Jesus, not for these guys, they're going to get their legs broken to cause them to suffocate. But for Jesus, around your heart, you have what's called a pericardium. And the pericardium is a sac. It's just literally all it is, right? And then in that sac is a lubricant, right? And your heart sits in there. And what that does is it allows it so the faster your heart beats, you don't generate too much heat around your heart, and it doesn't cause damage to the heart muscle, right? So in a crucifixion, because you begin to have so much stretching, the pericardium actually rips, and it tears open. And what happens is that from the tearing of the different tissue inside and the elongating of the arms, brachial arteries, different things like that, the cavity begins to fill with blood, and so you begin to have cardiac tamponade, which is where your heart, as it contracts, blood comes in and it can't expand as much. And so you literally begin to feel like you're having a heart attack, but for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. And then eventually, depending if it's thirst or, there's different things, or the heart actually tears, that's how you die. So when it says that his heart melted within him like wax, it's a prophetic and a metaphoric way of saying that that's how he died, from his heart finally ripping. So these guys are doing that. And yet, what we're going to read now is incredible. It says there, but the other, verse 40, criminal rebuked him. Do you not fear God, he says, since we are under the same sentence? So this guy begins to tell the other one, hey, be quiet. What are you doing? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our needs deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to him, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and the darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. For the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Again, a whole nother awesome teaching about the symbolic gesture of a reality of an absolute open holy of holies, that anyone has access to the presence of God now. But he says, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. And the centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went their way. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So we have all this thing that goes down, and then he finally dies. So what does that mean for us? Because you kind of have this emotional, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but you have this emotional assent to the terribleness of this. We may even have an intellectual assent to consider how bad this was against a person, and how incredible it is that one sent by God could love humans this much in that kind of a condition, in that kind of adversity, in that kind of violence against them. But then what does it actually do? Right? Beyond some sort of emotional plea to my heart or make me buy cross jewelry or something, what does it actually do for me? And this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the gospel becomes incredible news. You don't have to turn there for time's sake. I'm going to just read the verse, but if you want to jot it down, it's Romans 3:25. Says this, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. So our first idea is that God presented Christ. Christ didn't just arbitrarily arrive here. That it was a plan. Now, we know that, right? But it was a plan. It had been planned out, and that the Father actually brought Jesus as his son and presented him to the earth. Think about that. That it was a, here he is. It was a voluntary giving. And he wanted the whole earth to see him. He presented him. But to do what? A sacrifice of atonement. So atonement, the word atonement means this. It's a place, it's a noun. It's a mercy seat or a place of propitiation. Propitiation is kind of a fancy Christian word, and it just means that it's the exact right payment. His payment was complete and right. That's what propitiation means. And so when Paul here, writing to the Romans, says this, he's demonstrating that Christ's sacrifice was a perfect payment through his blood to be received by faith.